They sold them to the crowd as the ultimate symbols of Roman masculinity, sculpted bodies, dripping sweat, roaring in the arena, while women in silk fainted from the stands and senators placed secret bets on their lives. But behind the roar of the amphitheater and the polished marble statues, there was another Rome, one that preferred the torches apagatas, the doors trancadas, and the witnesses silenced. Because the most horrifying sexual practices involving gladiators didn't happen under the sun. They happened in the shadows, where law, consent, and dignity stopped at the edge of the sand. Gladiators were not just warriors, they were property. And in a world where the body of a slave belonged entirely to his owner, even desire had a price, a hierarchy, and a script. In the Ludi, the gladiator schools, intimacy could be a weapon, a currency, a punishment, or a twisted privilege granted by someone who owned your next breath. Rome turned their pain into spectacle, and their private lives into a market no historian on a triumphal arch wanted to carve in stone. Tonight, we are going to open that door, and once you cross it, you will never look at a Roman gladiator the same way again. To understand how horrifying the sexual practices around gladiators really were, we have to start by dismantling the myth Rome carefully built around them. In the imagination of the empire, the gladiator was a fantasy made flesh, strong, fearless, hypermasculine, an object of desire and terror, al mesmo tempo. Poets insinuated that noble women son havum cum els, perfumes were named after their sweat, and even hair taken from their helmets was sold as amulets. But this image, repeated for centuries, was only a beautiful mask. Beneath the bronze, the oil, and the roar of the arena, gladiators formed the lowest legal category of Roman society, infames. That word alone already reveals everything. They had no legal voice, no social honor, no control over their bodies. They could be hired, rented, lent, used, and discarded without any tribunal asking why. In the Ludi, the gladiator schools scattered around the empire, 500 or 1,000 men podium viver enclausurados behind walls that smelled of iron, blood, and cheap wine. They came from everywhere, condemned criminals, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war from the fringes of the empire, desperate citizens who had signed away their freedom in exchange for money, food, or a twisted promise of glory. Once inside, their identity was stripped away. They received a fighting style, a helmet type, a diet, and a schedule that regulated every minute of the day. But there was something else that the training schedules never mentioned, something that official inscriptions never registered: what happened to their bodies when the lights went out and the doors were locked. Because where there is absolute power over someone's body, there is always the temptation to turn that body into a private playground. The lanista, the owner and manager of the gladiator school, did not only control how the fighters trained and who they fought. He controlled who could touch them, who could see them, who could borrow them for a night. Wealthy matrons, frustrated aristocrats, young nobles bored with conventional pleasures, all of them sabium that behind the arena there existed an invisible market. A gladiator could be rented like a luxury object, the same man who in the afternoon risked his vida para divertir. The crowd could at night be forced to entertain the powerful in ways no marble relief ever shows. For Rome, the horror of this situation was disguised behind a legal fiction. A gladiator was property, and property had no consent. If the owner decided that a certain fighter would be offered as a reward to a patron who financed the ludus, the so-called honor of the gladiator was irrelevant. Roman moral panic was always directed at the status of the person in the dominant role, never at the humanity of the person being used. As long as the free citizen kept the socially accepted posture, dominant, commanding, never appearing submissive, almost anything done to an infamous body remained invisible, acceptable, or at most whispered as gossip. Within the walls of the ludus, this created a suffocating emotional climate. The same men who were supposed to embody invulnerability knew, in the most intimate level, that the skin they trained so hard to protect had no legal protection at all. A compliment from a patron could be the prelude to a night that felt less like a favor and more like a sentence. A look from the lanista could mean promotion or exposure. The line between privilege and punishment became blurred, because the mechanism was always the same: your body belonged to others. Fame in the arena could increase the price of your fights, but it also increased the price of your nights. This is the first layer of the horror Rome tried to hide. Not orgies de fantasia, como cinema gusta de mostrar, but a cold, structured system in which sexuality was not about desire between two people, but about power flowing in only one direction. The gladiator's body was a battlefield even when there was no sand under his feet. And before we talk about the emotional and intimate bonds formed between the fighters themselves, we have to remember that everything happened under the constant shadow of this ownership. Any gesture of affection, any search for comfort, any attempt to build something human inside that prison of iron and sweat would always collide with a brutal fact. Rome did not see gladiators as men. It saw them as tools. And tools in that world could be used in whatever way their owners wished. When a new recruit crossed the gate of Eludus, he rarely entered as the monster that the arena later would try to show. Many were young, barely having left adolescence, their faces still carrying the softness of someone who had known more plow than sword, more market than battlefield. Others arrived with old scars, veterans of wars lost against Rome, now condemned to bleed for the same audience that had celebrated their defeat. Whatever their origin, one truth united them. They had been arrancados from their world and thrown into a universe where every sound, every rule, every look was new and threatening. In this environment, the figure of the veteran gladiator emerged as something more complex than the simple stereotype of the brutal trainer. This man, with his bones already marked by fractures and his skin mapeada por cicatrices, knew better than anyone the invisible rules of the place, who could be confronted and who should be feared in silence, when to speak and when to lower the gaze, how to survive not only the fights, but also the nights. Officially, he was a teacher of technique, responsible por ajustar, the posture of the recruit, correcting the movement of the sword, and teaching how to fall without dying. But in practice, he often became something closer to a guardian, a shield against the worst abuses of the system, sharing a cell to escape the cold, dividing a piece of bread after an exhausting session, cleaning each other's wounds when the medicine of the school had already gone. It was in these apparently small acts that a type of bond began to form, a bond Rome never wanted to describe with clarity. The recruit, isolated from everything he had known, found in the veteran not only a model to imitate, but also a source of emotional refuge. In a world where the lanista could decide overnight who would fight to the death and who would be allogado to a patron, having someone who explained quietly what each gesture meant could be the difference between a bearable life and a nightmare semsaida. It is here that the most delicate and complex zone begins. Because when two people share years of fear, routine, bodily proximity, and mutual dependence in an environment that denies any other form of comfort, the emergence of deeper feelings is not an exception, it is almost inevitable. Modern psychology would call it bonding under trauma, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, emotional dependence, and desire for protection. But for the men of that time, there were no words sutis to name this. Rome had an extensive vocabulary for conquest, honor, and defeat, but almost none for what happened in the silence of a shared cell. The hierarchy of the ludus also penetrated these bonds. The veteran, with more prestige and relative autonomy, occupied the dominant social role, the one who took decisions, who protected, who could intervene if a patron or an official tried to cross certain limits with the younger fighter. The recruit, in the shadow of this protection, occupied a position simultaneously vulnerable and privileged, because being under the wings of a respected gladiator could deter opportunistic eyes. But this same hierarchy could transform an affectionate bond into something ambiguous, where emotional dependence and obligation, caminham lado a lado, was the closeness a free choice or the only safe refuge in a world without alternatives? Was the tenderness an act of resistance against the system or another layer of control, this time covered by caresses instead of chains? The truth is that, for many, it was both at once. We have no letters from gladiators speaking to their sweet so-and-so, as the legionaries sometimes did. But we have graffiti, drawings, dedications scratched in plaster that betray a type of intimacy deeper than simple comradeship. Two names repeated together in more than one wall, small phrases like, "he fought for him," or symbols pairings that seemed to bind destinies. In a school near Capua, an inscription mentions a gladiator that refused to leave his companion even when offered a chance of freedom. These small fragments, though scarce, are like fissures through which we glimpse a world affettivo that most chroniclers chose to cover with silence. Within these relationships, it is very likely that some type of sexual intimacy sometimes emerged, not in the eroticized way modern imagination likes to paint, but as an extension physical of a bond already emotionally fused by fear and loyalty. To judge these practices with contemporary moral categories would be misleading. In that context, sharing the bed was not necessarily about labels of identity, but about a search for calor humano, in a place built to extract every last drop of individuality. Yet, even here, the shadow of the external sexual economy never disappeared. A tender night between two fighters could be interrupted by the sound of a guard's keys, by the order of a lanista, or by the arrival of someone to whom the school owed a favor. Thus, the mentorship in the ludus was simultaneously sanctuary and trap. It offered protection against the most predatory aspects of the system, but it also anchored the recruit to a hierarchy where even affection could be used to demand sacrifice. When that veteran later asked the younger man to stand by his side in an unfair fight, or to endure humiliation in silence so as not to provoke the lanista, the debt was not written in any contract, but was engraved in the memory of every shared night and every wound closed. In Rome's public narratives, gladiators were beasts moved only by ambition or fear of death. But inside the schools, their survival depended on something far older and more human: the capacity to build hidden bonds in a world that denied them even the right to say, "This body is mine." If the cells and training yards of the ludus were the place where intimate bonds were born, the arena was the altar where those bonds were tested ate o limite. To the eyes of the crowd, everything seemed simple: 2 men, 2 weapons, a spectacle of skill and blood. But for the gladiators, each entrance to the sand was charged with a web of silenciosas, obligations, promises, and rituals that had more to do with emotional survival than with official rules. On the morning of a great show, the atmosphere inside the school was almost religious. Weapons were sharpened, bodies were oiled, the murmurs between fighters lowered to a tone that mixed fear and concentration. In corners that the lanista rarely surveilled, small ceremonies took place: a piece of bread broken and shared between 2 men who knew that one might not return, an amulet touched in unison, a brief embrace disguised as a shove, just long enough for one hand to squeeze the back of the other with more pressure than a simple gesture of encouragement. These were not orgiastic rituals, but acts of quiet desperation, attempts to carve out a space of meaning in a life where the empire had turned death into entertainment. In this context, a particular concept of honor took shape, differente da quelle celebrado in senatorial speeches. For the crowd, honor was dying well, falling dramatically, accepting the verdict of the thumb without hesitation. For the gladiator, honor was often something more intimate: not abandoning the companion with whom he had shared years of training, not striking a final blow in a way that betrayed a pact, not exposing, in the middle of the sand, vulnerabilities that had been entrusted to him in the darkness of the cell. The most terrifying sexual practices of this world were not only those imposed by the upper classes, but also those that transformed intimacy in a bargaining chip when life was at stake. Imagine 2 fighters, bound by a bond that had grown from mentorship into something deeper, being assigned to confront each other publicly. Lanista sabia exactly what he was doing. A duel between 2 popular gladiators was gold at the ticket office. A duel between 2 men whose closeness had not gone unnoticed in the school. That was pure cruelty disguised as spectacle. In that moment, every night of shared consolation became a dagger with 2 edges. Surrender too easily, and the crowd would sense something wrong. Fight too hard, and every strike would land not only on flesh, but on years of complicity. In this dance, even the slightest movement could hide a coded message: a cut made in a less lethal area as a sign of mercy, a fall dramatized to convince the public that the fight had been real, a glance stolen before the final blow asking silently for forgiveness. Rome did not have cameras to record these nuances, but its stones speak. In some amphitheaters, graffiti has been discovered that mention gladiators described as most faithful to his companion, or who died saving his friend. In others, drawings show pairs of fighters not in combat, but standing side by side, sharing victorious laurels or under the protection of the same deity. These images suggest that the crowd, though thirsty for blood, also perceived and perhaps celebrated another kind of bond, one that turned the arena into a stage for hidden stories of loyalty and devotion. Yet, even here, the sexual dimension was never completely absent. A gladiator who was known to be favorite of some noblewoman or powerful patron could be forced to demonstrate his value in the arena not only with his sword, but with his willingness to survive for the pleasure of those who used him in private. Beyond duels, there were also so-called reaffirmation rituals, practices that emerged from the need to reconcile public performance with private hierarchies. After moments of emotional vulnerability, tears shared over a fallen companion, nights of particular terror or intimacy, some gladiators sought to compensate in training with displays of extreme force. They engaged in friendly but brutal wrestling, contested in exhausting exercises, pushed each other to the limit as if needing to remind themselves and others that their bonds did not diminish their ferocity. These physical contests had a double function. They reassured the group that emotional closeness had not softened. Its members in a world obsessed with hardness, and at the same time offered an acceptable channel to process feelings that had no other legitimate escape. Thus, the arena, far from being just a place of death, became the final mirror of all the contradictions of gladiator life. In each combat, there could be echoes of nights of forced submission to a patron, memories of secret caresses shared to escape despair, debts of protection between veteran and recruit, silent pacts not to reveal what Rome insisted on calling shame. The public saw only blood and banners. The men on the sand knew that every drop carried stories that no poet of the imperial court would dare to write. In the end, the most horrifying practices were not separated from honor. They were intertwined with it, forming a knot so tight that, to this day, historians struggle to separate where the spectacle ends and where the violence against the intimate humanity of these men begins. Any system that concentrates absolute power over bodies inevitably generates monstrosities, and the world of gladiators was no exception. While some bonds inside the ludi were born from mutual need and genuine affection, others were forged in the darkest corners of power and fear. The same legal structure that allowed a lanista to rent his fighters for banquets or private favors opened the door to forms of sexual abuse that rarely left written traces, but that scream between the lines of the laws and punishments of the time. Roman jurists debated how far the authority of an owner could go without destabilizing the social order. They created rules to protect citizens of high status from scandal, not to protect the infames from suffering. Some decrees mention penalties for owners who dishonored excessively their enslaved performers, not because they cared about them, but because such excesses could generate unrest, retaliations, or loss of valuable property. Other texts speak of gladiators being transferred from one school to another after conflicts with the management, phrases so vague that they beg for interpretation. Between these lines lives a hidden reality, that of fighters used as sexual trophies, forced to submit to the desires of officers, patrons, or even other gladiators whose proximity to the lanista turned them into mini-tyrants within the school. In these cases, intimacy ceased completely to be a refuge and became another face of punishment. A fighter who angered a superior might be given to someone known for enjoying humiliation. A recruit refusing to obey could be threatened not only with more dangerous fights, but also with nights reserved for clients notorious for their cruelty. Because the body of the gladiator was a currency, it could be spent in the most degrading ways as a warning to others. Rome used crucifixion to intimidate rebels in public. Inside the ludi, it used sexual terror to discipline without witnesses. Yet even in this darkness, traces of resistance appear. Fighters created networks of protection that functioned outside any written regulation. Older gladiators, aware of the patterns of abuse, sometimes surrounded the most vulnerable with a shield of intimidation, standing between them and the guards at certain hours, accompanying them when summoned to suspicious meetings, making it clear, with a single look or a seemingly casual gesture, that hurting that recruit would have consequences among the fighters. It was not a fair system. It depended on the charisma and strength of some to mitigate the vulnerability of others. But for many, it was the only barrier left between them and complete despair. There are also hints, in later sources, of more drastic forms of retribution. A few chronicles of particularly bloody games mention the accidental deaths of certain officials during chaotic battles, or the disappearance of minor commanders in campaigns where gladiators had been integrated into auxiliary units. While these mentions are always wrapped in ambiguity, lost in the fog of war, fell in confusion, they have led some historians to suspect that, in extreme cases, the arena could become the perfect stage for accidents that were nothing more than vendettas carefully camouflaged. A lanista, or officer who abusu repetidamente de seus lutadores, might, one day, find himself too close to an enraged animal, too exposed to a mistaken blow, too isolated on a battlefield where witnesses had every reason to keep quiet. From a modern perspective, we might be tempted to imagine great revolts, open denunciations, a clear narrative of victims and villains. But the reality of the time was much more complex and cruel. Most resistance was necessarily silent, coded, negotiated in the shadows. A fighter might endure abuse in order to protect someone more fragile. Another might accept the role of favorite, of a powerful patron, if that guaranteed better food and medical care for his closest companions. Decisions were rarely pure. They were compromises forced by a structure that transformed even the most intimate aspects of existence into strategic calculus. Psychologically, the cost was immense. The same man who in the arena seemed fearless poderia carregar, dentro de si, oceano de vergonha, raiva e confusao. How to reconcile the applause of thousands with the memory of nights in which he had no control over his own body. How to believe his value depended on his skill with the sword, when he knew that sometimes his survival depended on his ability to satisfy desires he never chose. Modern studies on trauma in contexts of captivity help us understand part of this paradox. The mind creates compartments, erects walls, tries to separate the public self from the private self. Many gladiators probably learned to inhabit these compartments, turning off a part of themselves to endure and reactivating another to survive. In the end, the empire that loved to exalter sua disciplina and control had built inside its arenas a laboratory of uncontrolled power, where the most horrifying sexual practices were not aberrations, but the logical outcome of a world that denied humanity to those it used for entertainment. The fact that so little was written explicitly about this says less about the absence of such acts and more about the fear of confronting what they revealed about Rome itself. To truly see what happened to the bodies of gladiators would be to admit that the so-called civilization that ruled the Mediterranean was founded not only on roads and laws, but also on an intimacy colonized by violence. When the rare day arrived in which a gladiator received freedom, whether by surviving enough seasons, by being bought and freed, or by some extraordinary favor, his life did not simply return to normal. How could it? He had spent years or decades in a world where his body had been ao mesmo tempo arma, mercedoria e trofeu, the sand washed with water, the walls of the ludus repaired, but the marks that truly mattered were not on stone, they were on the soul. Many freed gladiators chose to remain near the schools or amphitheaters where they had fought. Some opened taverns, small businesses, or worked as trainers for new generations of fighters. Others bought modest houses with the few savings they had managed to accumulate. And yet, wherever archaeology has found their traces, one pattern repeats: they rarely walked alone. Tombstones, dedications, and inscriptions mention pairs of ex-gladiators who bought land together, who set up enterprises as partners, who were buried lado a lado under the same epitaph. Sometimes, no family relationship is mentioned. Only two names, two helmets carved together, two cups, two identical rings. For Roman society, this could be interpreted as simple friendship between comrades of arms, a brotherhood forged in battle. But when we remember everything that happened inside the ludi mentorships that turned into emotional dependence, shared cells that became the only refuge, bonds sealed with blood and tears, it is difficult not to suspect that for many these partnerships were the form socially acetaval of a connection much more profound. Free at last from the direct authority of the lanista, some men seem to have chosen to transform their clandestine companionship into a kind of chosen family, a miniature household where they could organize their days, sem olhos de guardas e portas trancadas. Of course, nem todos tiveram essa sorte. Many were separated violently. A fighter could receive land in a distant province, while his closest companion remained tied to the ludus. Another could die in the arena just when the two had almost reached the number of victories necessary for manumission. The few letters and epitaphs that touch on these separations are loaded with a saudade that transcends simple comradeship. "May the gods guard you where you went," writes one inscription. "No fire is as warm as the nights we spent by the brazier," says another, found near an amphitheater dedicated by a freedman to a gladiator who never left the school. Words like these suggest that, for some, the most painful wound of freedom was precisely the absence of those who had taught them how to survive captivity. Viewed through the lens of modern psychology, the emotional lives of these men resemble what happens today with soldiers returning from war, people leaving cults, or survivors of exploitation networks. They carry inside them a mixture of trauma and nostalgia, fear and gratitude, inability to adapt to a normal life and reluctance to abandon the only community in which, despite all horrors, they had felt some form of belonging. The sexual practices that the Empire forced upon them were not isolated events. They became part of the way these men learned to understand their own value, their own bodies, their right, or lack thereof, to pleasure and affection. Rebuilding a sense of dignity after such an experience was a journey for which Rome offered almost no tools. And yet, it is precisely in the traces left by these freed gladiators that we find the final piece of this story. Altars dedicated por duism homines, to the gods who protected us that night. Testaments leaving goods to the companion who shared my fights and my bread. Small, discreet gestures of care recorded in stone, almost always without explicit details, but with a symbolic density that any attentive eye can feel. These are not the marks of a purely economic relationship, nor merely of professional collegiality. They are the fossils of a type of bond that the official histories refuse to name, but that the human heart sculpted anyway in the only places it could, in memory, in ritual, in shared death. When we put together all these fragments, the legal status of gladiators as property, the sexual economy that surrounded them, the mentorships that protected and sometimes dominated recruits, the secret pacts in the arena, the abuses disguised as privilege, the silent resistances and the partnerships that persisted after freedom. The most horrifying sexual practices of Roman gladiators were not sensational anecdotes lost in some orgy legend. They were a structural feature of a world that transformed the body into an extension of the arena. Even when there was no sand under their feet, these men continued living on a battlefield where what was at stake was not only life and death, but also the right to feel, to desire, to refuse. In the end, Rome fell. The arenas crumbled, the ludi became ruins, the names of most gladiators disappeared in the dust. But the questions they leave us are still alive. What happens to a society that treats some bodies as objects of entertainment, consumption, and disposable pleasure? How many civilizations built their glory on the control not only of territories, but also of intimacy? And, perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, how many of these dynamics still echo today, disguised by new costumes, new laws, and new arenas of glass and light? If this journey through the hidden life of gladiators made you rethink what Rome really was, and what power still does to the most vulnerable, don't let the story end here. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who still believes the Empire was just marble, glory, and epic battles. Because only when we expose the truths they tried to hide, que a historia deja de ser propaganda, or cómica, finalmente a ser humana,